Welcome to today's webinar, Brain Science, Interventions and Policy Implications, brought to you by NCSL. Please use the chat box on the lower left-hand side of your screen to send in any questions you may have throughout the presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Julie Poppy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us on this webinar today. My name is Julie Poppy, and I'm with the Early Care and Education Project at NCSL, and I thank everyone for being on the webinar called Brain Science, Interventions, and Policy Implications for Serving Parents and Children. We're so excited. Today we have approximately 30 states on the webinar. I'm also joined on the line today by Allison May with the Early Care and Education Program at NCSL. We're really excited with today's turnout, like I said, and we know this is going to be an interesting and informative call, and we've got a lot to cover. I am really excited to also mention that we have a bunch of legislators and legislative staff from a lot of states. If we could just take a moment now to have folks type into the chat box the state that they're joining us today, that would give us a sense of who's here on the call. During this webinar, you'll learn about the brain science and the implications of stress on the brain, what it is, why it's important, and possible interventions that state lawmakers and policymakers can take to mitigate toxic stress to support early development of young children. Just wanted to mention that an archived copy of this webinar will be available and posted to NCSL's website shortly. Once posted, Allison will send out an email alerting you to the availability of the archived copy. I also wanted to mention that today's presentation is available for download in our media library. So our goal for the next hour is to make this presentation as interactive as possible. Should you have a question, like the moderator noted, you can type them in at any time in the chat box that you see on your computer screen. We'll aim to answer as many questions as possible during and at the conclusion of the presentation, giving questions coming from legislators and legislative staff top priority. If we're unable to answer all questions by the end of the webinar, we'll send out questions of the remaining questions via email. So before I turn the webinar over to our presenter, I just want to share a little information about Sarah Wadamura. We're pleased to have a national expert in brain science and stress to speak with us today. Sarah Wadamura is director of the Child Health and Development Lab and is an associate professor of the University of Denver. Dr. Wadamura has a long-standing interest in children's physiologic regulation and the development of physical and psychological stress. She has recently expanded her work to include the unique stressors and buffers that may be important for physiologic stress among families experiencing poverty and other stressors. So with that, I'm going to hand over the call to Dr. Wadamura.
Thanks, Julie. Can everybody hear okay? Yeah, great. I did actually get bumped off while you were talking and logged back in, so if that happens, I know how to get back on, but I'm not sure why that happened, but we'll keep track of it.
Okay. Thanks for letting us know.
Sure. So we are going to talk about a fair amount of information today. As Julie mentioned, I'm happy to answer questions as we go. We'll take a couple breaks at specific points for people to ask questions, and then we can also handle that via email afterwards. There are also a couple of resource papers that can give you if you want to read more about any of these topics. So we're going to highlight, today we're going to talk about 4 top relevant lines of research for programming and policy for children and families. First, we're going to talk about how early experiences are particularly impactful. So what is so special about the early life period? Lots of people think about the efficiency of intervening early. So we'll talk really briefly about that. And then we're going to talk about the idea of toxic stress, early life stress and toxic stress, and what that framework offers. Then we're going to switch gears and talk about the transition to parenting and the many changes that happen to the parents' brains when they become parents and how that presents a really interesting, important opportunity. And then briefly we'll talk about risk and opportunity transmission intergenerationally and think about time points in the lifespan that might be particularly useful times or efficient, effective times for intervention. So starting with the first topic about why early experiences themselves are so impactful. The main reason for this is that we are born with these really big, really underdeveloped brains. So it turns out that means that the infant is not at all formed, right? So if you've seen a newborn human, they are really underdeveloped, and they're looking then for input from the environment in order to determine what kind of world they're in, what kind of language they're going to speak, what kind of experiences they should be prepared for. And so this very early underdeveloped brain is actually quite different from other animals. And it means that in the first 3 years of life, we have this extended period where we're taking in information and sort of setting up the brain and body for the life to come. And so we see across that first few years of life lots of adaptation and development in key areas of the brain and body. So that set up how we will ultimately see, hear, respond, develop language, have emotion control, symbol learning, numbers, and social skills. So lots of that basic capability being set by 3, but not set by 1 or at birth. In contrast, other newborn mammals are born much more physically developed. So these mammals, these are all newborn mammals who can walk. And so they are able to walk over to their mother and initiate nursing. That's quite different from what human infants are able to do. So, for example, this is human motor development, where you don't see the typical child walking alone independently until 15 or so months, 12 to 18 months. So the flip side of that, so that's sort of the negative side, right? This sort of long, slow developmental period where it takes a long time before human infants are relatively independent. And of course, even at 1, they're not independent, but they are able to walk. So what might be the advantages that come with this slower development that happens and not having everything set at birth? There are actually quite a few advantages, and they seem to have to do with the fact that the individual then can have much specialized experience. So you could live anywhere in the world. Babies that are born today might go to Jupiter. They could have any career. And so their life trajectory is not determined at birth. Instead, it is going to result from all of the things that happen, their biologic capabilities and their environmental inputs. Lots of people have looked at how those inputs happen, so how do those early experiences sort of matter for babies' development. And this is my favorite studies. This is an old study from the 80s, where what they did is they asked moms, pregnant moms who were 7.5 months pregnant, to read 2 times per day a specific passage from The Cat in the Hat. If you have read The Cat in the Hat or remember it at all, it's very repetitive. So if you turn from one page to another, the cadence is very similar. There's lots of rhyming. So they had moms read one specific section of The Cat in the Hat, and then when the babies were born, they had the babies listen to the section that their mom read them or another section from the same book. So they would have been very similar in terms of the way they sounded. They would both have been read by their mom. And they had the babies control the audio. So half of the babies had to suck the pacifier really, this is a picture from the study here, had to suck the pacifier really hard in order to hear their mom read the passage that they heard in the womb. And the other half of the babies had to suck the pacifier, stop the pacifier in order to hear the passage that they heard in the womb. So that's actually a really important control. So it wasn't just that they were excited or enthusiastic about hearing it. They actually did whatever was required from them, sucking more or sucking less, in order to hear the passage that they heard in the womb as compared to another very similar passage. So it's pretty convincing evidence that they learned that part of the story and remembered it at birth, which is just incredible and amazing. And it's a nicely controlled study, so it's one of my favorite examples of how early babies are taking in input about what kind of world they're in. This is another example of why plasticity is an advantage. So when babies are born, they can hear all the possible sounds of all the languages in the world. there are actually a lot of sounds that are possible in human languages, and new babies can hear them all. Of course they can, because they could be born anywhere in the world or adopted anywhere in the world. But we cannot, adults cannot hear all the sounds in all the languages of the world. And that capability actually drops off in the first year of life. So babies initially can hear all the sounds of all the languages in the world, and then they hone in and can only hear the sounds of the languages that they are exposed to. So in this particular line of research, you see English-speaking infants who are exposed to English, initially can hear a particular sound in a language spoken by Hindi families, and then by 10 to 12 months they can no longer hear that sound, whereas of course infants who are exposed to that language are able to hear it. So that advantage, that plasticity advantage, lets them be anywhere, adapt any kind of environment, but in that early period of life, it really becomes focused, the baby becomes focused on the input that they are receiving. So because of that, we think that the types of inputs that they're getting early are very important for what kind of, how they subsequently develop. It is most of the time when you hear about examples, those are the really easy examples to give you about language. You might get the impression that it's only sort of language or cognitive things that are impacted by those early experiences, but that actually is not the case. So the way the brain develops has implications for social and emotional processes as well. So in this particular study, what's talking about is that the brain is expecting that the baby will see faces right away after birth. Babies love to look at faces. They will see faces right away after birth, and seeing faces right away after birth helps them learn ultimately how to understand and express emotion. And then they also have individualized experience, because how you express emotion appropriately depends on your culture. And so babies will learn different expressive rules based on the culture that they're in by looking at faces, having exposure to different types of expression. So it'll be different depending on what they see. In the concept that I work in, where we work with families who are experiencing lots of adversity, we are particularly concerned about infants who might be exposed to only or primarily to negative expression, or not a lot of facial expression, not being able to look at faces up close very frequently, and that ultimately can restrict their ability to detect the full range of possible human emotion expressed in the culture that they live in. It makes them very good at detecting negative facial expressions, for example, better than infants who have not been exposed to a lot of negative adult faces, but not as good at detecting that full range. And that type of thing has been shown in different ways. So older children who are exposed to more conflict in the home are better able to detect the point at which an adult voice becomes angry from neutral than children who have been exposed to much less conflict are slower to notice that an adult's voice has become negative. But again, they're focusing their attention and energy on a particular type of signal that they have been exposed to. So the brain is looking for those experiences. It isn't possible to do everything. It isn't possible to continue to hear every single language and every possible way you could be. So you develop according to the experiences that you have. Another reminder of how early all of this starts is that the fetal brain under active construction by 7 weeks gestation, which is 5 weeks post-conception. So very, very early, brain cells begin communicating with each other and trying to determine how the brain should be organized. There are over 100,000 nerve cells born per minute in the fetal period. And so pregnant women are, hosting this amazing development and growth that is happening really, really quickly and intensely. And therefore, it's not surprising that when people are pregnant, they often feel tired and have, extra supports would be great. And then at birth, the baby will have 100 billion nerve cells. So a lot of nerve cells are born. They still have to figure out what their jobs are going to be. They have to migrate to the right part of the brain. They have to learn how to talk to each other, but they are in place. so another way of looking at this kind of question is to look to see whether if infants have more negative experiences during pregnancy, does that change the way they develop? So in this line of research, which was conducted by my colleague Dr. Davis, pictured on the bottom left, we're going to sort of walk through this graph from top left to bottom right. What they did is they recruited pregnant moms, and they measured their stress hormones during pregnancy. And then they, at birth, when babies were born, they went to the hospital for the heel stick blood draw. A heel stick blood draw is a medically necessary procedure that all babies receive, and it's very important that they have this test in the hospital, but it is also a little aversive for them. So it is the first stressor that's applied to every baby born in a hospital. And so they're able to look at how the baby responds to this first stressor. So what they did is they went to the hospital and they measured the baby's reactions to this heel stick blood draw as a function of what kinds of stress hormone profiles mom had during pregnancy. So the yellow line are moms who had low levels of the hormone cortisol, which has lots of functions in the body, but one of them is to be responsive to stress. Early in gestation, the time when we don't expect those values to be high. And what you see is that the babies did react to the heel stick blood draw. They didn't like it. All the babies had sort of a response to that across the first minute. But the babies who had experienced low stress hormone exposure during early pregnancy went right back to baseline. By 2 minutes, they looked exactly the same as they did at the start of the test. As compared to the pink line, which are the babies had higher levels of cortisol during pregnancy, they had the same sort of initial reaction, but then they didn't recover across the time window that they were observed. And so the way we interpret that is that something about those early experiences that they had in the womb has primed me more vigilant when they are insulted. So in this case, they were poked and their heel was squeezed and it's full. They're maintaining sort of more awareness or vigilance about that event. They then track those same kids across time. They actually are still tracking them. They're in adolescence now. And when they were between 6 and 8 years of age, the babies who had, or the kids who had higher stress hormone exposure during pregnancy also were more likely to have higher anxious and depressed symptoms in middle childhood, so 6 to 8. And then the girls were also more likely to have larger right amygdala volumes. The right amygdala has again many functions in the brain, but one of its jobs is to track the environment for threat. And so we interpret this whole package of findings from the study to mean that something about those early experiences that the children have had, or something about their families, has made them more responsive to threats in the environment, more likely to watch for them, more nervous about them, and have a brain that's prepared to do that. Which, if you live in a highly threatening environment, is not necessarily a negative thing, but any allocation of resources to something has implications for whether you allocate resources to other things. And so when kids have to allocate lots of their resources to detecting threat in the environment, they become concerned that they don't have as many resources to do things that don't have immediate survival value. For example, learn something that has long-term benefit but no sort of immediate benefit, like algebra. All right. So let's go on to the next one. This is a different study. This was conducted in Oregon by some of my colleagues. What they did in this study is they wanted to look at the brains of infants. That is actually tricky to do because babies don't, if you've ever had an MRI, you know you have to go in there and be still, and it's quite loud. So babies, of course, can't be told to stay still in the magnet. And so in order to take an image of a brain, they go into the magnet when they're asleep. That limits the kinds of questions you can ask. And so they were very clever in this study, and they decided to play an audio file for the babies while they were sleeping, because we are able to hear while we're sleeping. And what the audio file was either angry or neutral adult voices. And then they also asked the families about how much fighting was going on at home, and parents reported what they felt comfortable reporting about that. And what they found in this study is that when parents reported more fighting happening at home, babies' brains were more responsive to angry versus neutral adult voices. And these are infants, so that we interpret that finding to mean that even while they're asleep, the babies are more likely to track their environment for danger signals when they have experienced more danger signals. All right. So that's kind of the first chunk. Does anyone have a clarification question at this point that I can answer? You can just type it right in the chat box. Would I be able to see if someone was typing? I don't want to prematurely cut people off.
Yes.
I would be able to. Okay, so yes. It looks like we're good. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section then, which is about early life stress and toxic stress. So the research on stress and development has been happening for many, many decades. It has been difficult to summarize and offer to people designing programs or policy to think about what it is that we know. And so these three gentlemen offered the toxic stress framework as a way to simplify and streamline what we know at this point about how stress impacts development. Jack Johnkoff on the far left is a pediatrician and has a long-standing involvement in making sure that information reaches the public. Tom Boyce is a pediatrician and researcher, and Bruce McEwen is a basic science researcher, so he works primarily in animal models. And so they work together on this framework called the stress framework. And basically, what the toxic stress framework does is it highlights that there are different types of experiences that classified by how they impact your development. So first, an important contribution of the toxic stress framework is the idea of positive stress. So we all need challenge in our in order to develop appropriately and have all of our capabilities. So challenge, positive stressful experience is very important for normal development. Those are challenges that happen in the context of normal everyday events, or even that are not as typical, maybe happen once or twice a year, but happen with supportive adults. So you might think of something like an immunization or trying out for a team. So those would be a couple that don't happen really often. They're very salient to the child. They challenge the body, they challenge the brain, but they're doing that with an adult typically, and that has positive effects on development. Then there are two other classifications of types of responses to environmental stressor. One is sort of the tolerable stress response, and one is the toxic stress response. So tolerable stresses are ones that events or experiences that could disrupt normal health development, but don't, because the individual child who's experiencing them has the resources to meet that demand. Toxic stress responses happen when the stressors are prolonged or serious and the child not have the buffering support of an adult. So it isn't that there's any sort of list of things we could say like this isn't a toxic stressor. What we can say is that individuals vary in their response to events, and whether their response is a tolerable stress response or a toxic stress response depends on the whole context. So what resources can the child bring to bear, what is available, and most particularly what adults are available to protect and buffer that child and help them process and interpret the experience that they're having. So if you imagine sort of a two-parent family who is living in your state, depending on where you live, the chance of different kinds of significant stressors varies. So let's say we have a parent family with a single child, and they experience a deployment, a deportation, a hospitalization for a serious illness, or incarceration, or a significant natural disaster. So say one of those things happens, and it takes one of the adults out of the picture. What's important about those types of stressors is that they're uncontrollable, so the family can't exert control over them, and they're unpredictable. So you don't know when they're going to happen, you don't know how long they're going to last. If we imagine our two-parent family who's gone through one of these experiences, let's imagine the other adult while feeling that this is a significant challenge, calls in their family from out of town, pulls in their resources at work, is able to keep their job and their finances stable, keep their housing stable, and is emotionally available to the child. In that context, we would refer to that as a tolerable stressor. So it's a significant event for the family. However, we do not expect that the child will change in body development in order to deal with that event, because they are able to rely on the adults and the resources that adult brings to bear. If you imagine the same situation, so a two-parent family living somewhere in your state who experienced a deployment, deportation, incarceration, or hospitalization, and the other parent, as could happen to any of us, it's actually very hard to predict when people will become overly distressed by this kind of event. Take the other adult becomes overwhelmingly distressed by the loss of their co-parent, and they are unable to call in or don't have available other resources like other people to come and live near them, have trouble maintaining their financial resources, their housing, their relationships, and therefore become unavailable to the child emotionally and physically. And so then for the child's perspective, that's now a toxic stressor, because from the child's perspective, they've essentially lost both parents. And so that child now takes on the responsibility for reorganizing their brain and body to deal with the challenge, which is adaptive, right? They're changing in order to deal with the situation they're in. But that change to their own body has a cost. So when we are looking to see whether something is a toxic stressor, we're looking at the whole context. We're looking at what has happened to the family and what resources they have brought to bear and are available to the child. That builds from a whole long line of research on the protective value of a single invested adult in a child, and it does not have to be someone related to them, and it doesn't have to be someone who lives in the home, but it does have to be someone who's consistently available to support that child. Okay, so that's the toxic stress framework that's meant to organize and sort of focus our attention on what we know from the scientific literature. And then if you want to think about what can be done, what is helpful often is to think about where you are on this map here. So how chronic and high impact is the stressor, and how supportive and responsive are the caregiving relationships, and what can you change? Of the things you can change, can you make the stressor less unpredictable or uncontrollable? Can you reduce the stressor itself? If you can't do that, or even if you can, increase the potential of the adults in the child's world to become more supportive and responsive. And sometimes that just means that they understand how critically important that is, because of course when a massive event happens to a family, if you imagine a flood or a natural disaster, there are a lot of demands on adults, right? They have to find new housing, they have to deal with insurance, they have to do all of those kinds of things, and so they may not always realize how that's affecting kids, and kids don't always show that behaviorally. So taking a sort of different perspective, we do know that chronic stress has long-term effects on health. It does so in a number of ways. So it influences both whether you get sick and what happens after you get sick. So we call that susceptibility or progression of illness. That's definitely true for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and infectious illness. And it's also true for some types of cancer and probably lots of other diseases that have not been as well studied. Part of the way that happens is that stressful experiences increase the risk of risk factors. So things like obesity, decreased immune function, or if you've gone to the doctor and had a triglyceride panel or something like that, it can increase metabolic syndrome. If you take the example of obesity, the stressful experiences are very demanding on energy. And so if you tell your body over and over, I'm going to need energy unpredictably, I may or may not have eaten recently, I need you to store energy. So your body will store energy, and the way we store energy is in fat. In fact, when people have experienced lots of stressors, they're not only more likely to carry more fat, they're more likely to carry more fat around the midline. We measure midline adiposity is what we call it. But another way to think of it is sort of like a little life raft you put around the middle so that you can get that energy store anywhere in the body that you need it if subsequent challenges and insults are happening. But of course we know that having extra fat around the midline a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So something that's an adaptation to the stress that's experienced can also result in reduced health and total lifespan. We also know that stressful experiences can, what we usually say is impair cognitive functioning. I like to think of it as sort of changing the priorities of the brain so that you remember and attend to events, of places, situations where you have experienced threat and stress. And by attending and remembering to those events, it becomes more difficult to attend to and remember other kinds of events, which has downstream effects on other cognitive processes. It is also the case that mental health concerns are elevated when people experience chronic stress. It's probably not surprising that if you're spending a lot of your attention and energy and memory on negative things that have happened or could happen, it's not a long walk from there to a depressive anxious illness. And so we see very highly elevated rates of depression and anxiety. You can also see elevated rates of what we call externalizing symptoms. So that's more behavior problems, acting out kinds of things when people have experienced chronic stress. And then the last sort of piece of the puzzle is that chronic stress accelerates aging. So it can, the way that we measure that is by looking at your telomere length, which are the end caps of your chromosomes. Every time a cell replicates, copies itself, which happens all day, every day, a little bit of that end cap comes off, which is fine because that's not your functional DNA, it's not important. But over time, that cap is gone. And when the cap is gone, then the structural, important, functioning, coding DNA is compromised. And so when that starts happening to all of your cells, that signals you're getting close to the end of life. So we're able to measure your telomere length and use it as a measure of your functional age compared to your chronologic age. So we all have a chronologic age, and you can think, I'm sure, easily in your mind of an example of somebody who seems functionally older than their chronological age, and an example of somebody who seems functionally younger than their chronologic age. So I live in Colorado, and I very frequently see white-haired folks, heading up big mountains or doing marathons. So we can measure that telomere length or telomerase activity, and we can see effects of stress on that aging process by 9 years of age. People also are birth. So at birth, people are in different maturational timelines. Some folks expecting to move through life sort of at a quicker pace than others. That, again, like all the things I have been talking about, has some adaptive value. If a society, a country, the world experiences a severe event, famine, a war, some kind of severe stressor, it is important that individuals can move more quickly through the life cycles. So not spend as much time in the womb, hit puberty earlier, childbear earlier. However, in a high-resource context or in a more leisurely time frame, we are hoping that new babies have time to reach their full term in the womb, hit puberty as late as possible after childhood, childbear after folks have stable relationships and good jobs, and then, experience a long, productive work career where they're contributing to society. And then even after the work years or in the back end of the work years, being able to be generative to the community. So our older citizens are very important folks in our communities in terms of contributing their knowledge, their resources, their time to our communities in many, many ways. And so if people live this sort of leisurely time frame and can do all of those things, it has many benefits for all of us versus if folks are really having to push through the life cycle quickly, that has consequences for all of us as well. So when we think about potential risk factors for total life expectancy, you're probably familiar with smoking, obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Those are 4 very common risk factors that are assessed regularly by medical professionals, and they take between 5 and 10 years off your total life expectancy. Childhood stress is thought to take up to 20 years off your total life expectancy. And so as a risk factor, it is a very important one. It's a complicated risk factor, right? So understanding exactly what to measure and how it works is what many of us are busy doing. And of course, those risk factors are not independent. So if you experience lots of stress in childhood, like I already talked about, you're more likely to carry extra weight, more likely to smoke. However, if we're looking for sort of a marker of where an investment might have the biggest payoff for us as a society and for individuals, childhood stress is a marker that has a lot of potential in that way. Where does that evidence come from? Where's that 20-year number come from? It comes from this study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. You may or may not have heard of it. It's very easy to look. You can go right to Google and type in CDC ACE, and you'll get lots of information about it. It was a collaborative effort between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and it began in 1995 in California. And what they did is they recruited about 17,000 patients who were all adults, and they asked them about the events that happened in their childhood in a long survey, actually. All kinds of different types of experiences, and using that information, they created what's called the ACE score, where they scored the presence or absence of 10 negative events that could have happened in childhood. Those include things like abuse and neglect. It includes parental divorce. It includes incarceration, substance use, or mental illness of a household member. So if you want to know your own ACE score, or you want to talk to your community or constituents about that, it's very easy to calculate your score now. You can just do like Google ACE score calculator, and it will tally it for you. It resulted from a more comprehensive assessment that they did in this project. And then what they did is they tracked folks' medical records. So Kaiser Permanente has a great electronic medical records system, and so they just tracked people across time based on their identification of these early risk factors. And there were a few really notable findings. The one I've already told you is that when people reported no early life adversity, if, say, at birth their life expectancy was 80, that would be what it is. If they reported 6 or more of childhood experiences where the total score, maximum possible score is 10, their life expectancy was now 60 years. So it had a very significant impact on life expectancy. We also see other inflection points. So at 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, people are much more likely to have a range of health conditions. And there are some health outcomes where you see a linear effect where even 1 or 2 adverse child experiences has a negative impact. And for other things, that's not the case. As I've already alluded to, the primary economic toll is to productivity loss. So when people are being at 60 versus at 80, it's having a pretty big impact on their contributions to society. And then there are also costs to healthcare, special education, child welfare, and criminal justice. ACEs are actually, just a couple other points I want to tell you about that. ACEs are actually very common, so only a third of people report 0 ACEs. That's actually pretty uncommon for people to have none. So 2/3 of us report at least 1 ACE. But then you see to have 4 or more, which is that first risk category I described, that's really only something like 12 to 15% of the population. So while many people might experience 1, a much smaller portion of the population are experiencing 4 or more, or enough that it's really impacting their health. If you want to look at the specific health outcomes that have been studied, it's very easy, like I've said, to find that information by going to the CDC website. And you may also be able to find information specific to your state, because many states have collected ACE data at least in 1 year using the BRFIS, which is the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System survey that happens every year in all states and territories. And so something like 32 states and territories have used the ACE module at least once, and therefore from someone in your state, you should be able to get numbers of ACE exposure in your state. And sometimes it's possible to get that by relevant demographic factors. So for example, we have that data in Colorado, and what I can do, the short version of the story, is when it's been done in every other state that's produced a report, the main finding from the original study is replicated. So it is the case that people who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are with significantly worse health in adulthood in all these various states where this has been studied, and much more recently, so like in 2012, 2014, instead of 1995 when the original sample was. So people feel like this finding is pretty stable. It is the case that when people tell you that they've had a lot of adversity in childhood, they're also reporting worse health. However, how exactly that's happening, there are lots of questions in there that we're all working on. Okay, let's take another quick break. What questions might you have I can answer before we move on? Nobody wants to type a question. I don't believe you really don't have any. There we go. Yeah, there's great interactive maps. Thanks for pointing that out. There are great interactive maps. There's so many online resources for the ACE information. Really, really easy to find. I did not define early childhood. The ACE study is any time before age 18. So it's actually any time in technically, sort of legal childhood, 18 and under 18. Early childhood, when I've talked about early life stress, which I have at other time points, people vary whether they say that's the first 3 years, the first 5 years, the first 1,000 days. There's a little bit of variance on that. It's at least the first couple, 2-3 years, and includes the fetal period.
So Sarah, we have about 15 minutes left before the top of the hour. Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right, so we're going to talk briefly about the changes that happen when people become new parents. This is a new line of research, and it's very interesting. The first study was published about 2011, and you can download the report. The link is on this page, or they might be sending it to you, also where we've sort of reviewed what's known about this and what it might mean for families. So it's a very exciting, fascinating new line of research. I'll have to tell you up front, there are a couple of limitations. So we know about first-time biologic mother and father changes to brains. We do not know about non-biologically related parents or about second children or later born children yet. It just hasn't been studied yet. So the basic idea here is that we know there's this first and most important sensitive period. That's my daughter. First important sensitive period, right, in this couple years of life. And we know that a lot of what happens for kids is the social, emotional, and educational environment provided by their parents, which we often talk about just the mother, although that's not the case, of course. So often when we talk about making a change for that child or that baby, if you wanted to come to my family and change some outcome for my child, you would be likely target me as the person you think could be the agent of change for her. So could I do something different? Could I read more often? Could I learn some new skills? Could I change something about my health or parenting or work or whatever you're targeting? But it is also the case that the parent is a changing agent. So at the same time that we're trying to change the parent, their brain and body are adapting to this new role. So this is us when my daughter was born. She was very cranky when she was first born. And we had a rough time in those first few months. She had a lot of trouble eating and sleeping, and you can see us over here on the right. She's clearly winning, and I'm clearly losing. And then we managed to pull it together by the time she was 2. So a lot of us are very interested in this early risk period, so between 0 and 6 months of age, roughly, and then sort of how to move families sort of out of that. So looking at the changes that happen to the brain is a really interesting way to do it. You probably feel that parenting changes your brain. If you are a parent and someone asked you if your brain changed after becoming a parent, you probably would say yes, and you would probably mean that it changed in a negative way, like you became less smart or something. However, that isn't really what the research is showing, or it isn't the whole story. If I measured your ability to perform on a very specific kind of task in a laboratory, yes, you would do worse than a 20 years without kids. But what about the full capabilities that you have developed, because now you're taking care of another person? We see changes to the brain that help change the way stress is handled, that promote positive emotions, specific kinds of positive emotions and bonding to children, increase parents' motivation to take care of that baby, which is really important because Of course, taking care of a new baby requires getting up many times in the night, putting a lot of your own personal needs to the side, and it promotes specific caregiving behaviors. This has been studied in both animal and human models, and as I mentioned before, in both human mothers and fathers. The changes we see happen in three sort of key parts of the brain. We see changes in the reward circuit, which is the part of your brain that helps you be motivated toward, food, relationships, those kinds of things, but can also be co-opted by drugs of abuse. So in this example, this was a study done with rats. Rats are very attracted to cocaine. So if you put them in a box where they press a lever to get cocaine or press a lever for food and water, they will press the lever for cocaine to the exclusion of drinking or eating. So it's very significant negative effect on them. If, however, you take a new mom rat and put her in a cage where she can press a lever to get cocaine or press a lever to hear her pup cry, she will press the lever to hear her pup cry. So it's the complete reworking of the reward circuit of the mom rat brain to be oriented around this signal coming from the infant. So it's a very substantial change. We see changes in the same areas of the brain in human mothers and fathers when they listen to their baby cry or look at pictures of their baby, and the degree of response that they have in their brain to those signals, the baby's picture and the baby's cry, is related to how much they say positive things about the baby, like it looks perfect, and the type of caregiving they provide. So they provide quality parenting when they have a more responsive brain. So that's what this says. Okay, and then we also see changes in the social infant circuit, which is the part of your brain that helps you detect social signals. It's different, for example, in people with autism. It makes a lot of sense because when you take a new baby home from the hospital, they don't provide reliable signals. You have to figure out when they're hungry and tired and bored and learn how to respond appropriately to that. So parents are spending a lot of attention trying to figure out those skills, and we see growth in areas of the social information circuit that support those changes. So that parents become the people who know what their babies need in a very specific way. So we see structural increases, so changes literally in the shape of an organization of the brain, and then also more responsiveness in this region to infant cries and pictures. And then the third area where we see changes are in the emotion regulation circuit. So those are the parts of the brain that help you handle when someone is distressed. So you have both detect that they feel upset and control your own response to that distress. And so that happens this area. So we see response in the amygdala controlled by the prefrontal cortex, and we see changes in those regions for new parents that help them do this really complicated job of parenting while doing many other things. So these changes appear to be very important for helping parents do this tough job. And we also see fewer neural changes when parents are stressed. So when they've experienced stress, depression, or substance abuse, they are less responsive initially to these infant signals. So one area for prevention and intervention is to see if we can boost that responsivity when we help parents with other kinds of programming. So then the last little thing I wanted to tell you is that risk and opportunity can be transmitted intergenerationally. Lots of people studying epigenetics, which are the ways that the environment changes your DNA is expressed. So which genes are expressed when and where is influenced by environmental signals. Lots of people trying to understand that. Not a lot of answers yet, but a lot of really interesting new things, so definitely keep your ears open for that. And we see sort of carry forward intergenerational transmission of both risk and opportunity. So when you move a family out of a negative situation, you can see downstream effects for kids. That's been shown even in an experimental design. But you can also, of course, see that negative effects be hard to escape. So when we're talking about families experiencing lots of stress, we can think about decreasing the stress to make it go from toxic to tolerable, or increasing the buffering, or both, so that we can move a family from a toxic stress environment to a tolerable or even a positive environment. I wanted to just point out that there's lots of new research on the important changes in the brain in adolescence. We typically talk about these in sort of a negative frame like, oh, they're not ready to make big decisions, they're not ready, they're taking lots of risks, they have trouble regulating their emotions. All of that is because their brain is not yet mature. But it's also the case, like all sensitive periods, that when you're in a sensitive period, it's open reset opportunity. And we see there is evidence that when kids experience adversity early in life and in adolescence, they have poorer outcomes than when they experience adversity at either time alone, suggesting that adolescence is a great time for intervention for kids who have had adversity already in early childhood and there was nothing done at that time. So intervention options include decreasing stressful circumstances for families, strengthening family community support, poverty alleviation, and policy changes, and increasing buffering opportunities. And then I think I was supposed to switch to this, just why is this important for you? Your major fiscal obligations are connected to all of these issues. Early and chronic toxic stress likely increases lost productivity, like we talked about, lost revenue, additional expenditures by state and federal government, crime, mental and physical illness, ER visits, low workforce preparation, intergenerational disadvantage, and health and continued economic disparities. And prevention and early intervention for stressed families could therefore be a very economic, efficient, and ethical way to prevent problems across all of these sectors. And I think one thing to do is, like, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the whole wheel, right? Can we evaluate programs we already have? Do we have programs that target these issues, and could we strengthen those programs? Would it be possible to improve the capability of the programs you have to use this kind of information effectively? Do they understand the current knowledge? Do they integrate that into their programming? Is it part of your continuing education requirements? Could that be a way to make change? And then can you evaluate the effects of proposed programs in this light? So if someone proposes a new program, can you ask the question, does this program directly tackle the effects of stress? How would it work differently for families living in high-stress situations? And how does it consider the interconnected needs and opportunities of parents and children? So 2 takeaway messages: your constituents are paying or losing a lot of money in part because of a lack of understanding and attention to these issues. And pushing forward may require attention to holistic family and community solutions. Tackling family, so providing services for parents and children at the same time, polls extremely well. So the average American thinks that makes a ton of sense across party lines and across a lot of different demographics, including when people are asked if they would support a 2-generation intervention, even if it increased their taxes. And those polling data are all available. All right, so questions?
Are there any questions? And if so, please remember just to type them in the chat box, and we'll get to them. But in the meantime, I have a few questions for you. First of all, thank you so much for all of this great information. It was wonderful to hear the science, and then also just to hear your thoughts on what you think policymakers and legislators could consider. So we'll wait for a question or two to come into the chat box, but in the meantime, I just wanted to ask you some other questions that have come up. So you had mentioned sort of the brain architecture in relationship to toxic stress, but the question is where does executive function and self-regulation sort of play into all that with children?
Sure. So it's a very central part of the puzzle. So some of the same brain areas we were talking about being impacted by stress are needed for those executive functions. And so developing executive function capabilities strengthens the brain. The brain is a muscle. It needs to be exercised. So they're very interconnected, and lots of people are working on that interface.
Thanks. And then we also got a question here in the chat box about, are you aware of any states that are doing particularly a good job with using their ACEs data to inform policies and programs?
Well, I'm not sure about the policy and program piece because that's not my area, but I do know that there are some states that have very well-developed databases and have put out reports. So that would include Wisconsin, Alaska, Colorado. We're about to put out a report in Colorado. There's a 5-state collaborative effort. Definitely some people have done that. And then I think lots of states have collected the data, and I don't know that it has happened with it. because when you check on the website, it says that a lot of states have administered it, but then I'm not able to access the data, so I'm not sure.
Sure. And then here at NCSL, we've done a little bit of tracking on this through our health program and then also through the work of our early care and education project. And I am aware of Tennessee and Wisconsin and Washington that have promoted these based on ACEs. So I'd be more than happy to get that information to the folks. We can certainly send out links as part of our research
Somebody
package.
just sent one from Tennessee, so great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, Tennessee, thanks. Yeah. And then, Washington State. So wonderful. Great chat box there, utilization.
Yes.
So another question I have too, while we're waiting for another question in the chat box is, so I had a question about the reliance on, or perhaps the overemphasis on, the brain science and its implications for policy, when there might be other factors to consider. So, and maybe the evidence base is possibly weak, although today's presentation I would think otherwise. But can you just comment on that?
Sure. I don't think the evidence base is weak. I think that's potentially not the issue. I think that maybe the core of it is, your brain and your body mirrors your everything else, right? So you might have a situation where it's more effective or efficient to just measure behavior or just ask people how they feel. But sometimes it is really helpful to look at the underlying biology of the folks you're talking about, because not everything is apparent from people's reports. And then the other reason that I think that it's really important to attend to biologic changes is that I think it's when we make a change in someone's behavior and we don't change their underlying biology, this is true in animal models and in humans, the next bump in the road, I think, is more offsetting than if we're really able to help people through behavior change and practice and all the kinds of that change your brain and help it grow, really change their biology. Then the next bump in the road, I think, is less offsetting. And so I think it's helpful. I think it's very expensive, and it isn't always necessary. So I wouldn't say that every study has to look at somebody's brain or their physiology. But I think we can leverage that information in ways that's really important.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. So one last call for any questions in the chat box, and we'll wait to see if we have anything. But I do have one last question for you. And it's in regards to maternal depression. Is there anything, I think you highlighted a little bit in terms of the multi-generational, two-generational approach, but is there anything that you can talk about on behalf of, policies that could be put into place to combat maternal depression?
Sure. I mean, maternal depression is one of the, it's sort of the most obvious low-hanging fruit. We know what to do about depression. It's super, super common. We know how impactful it is for early development and for kids and families. I mean, I would never, ever do a study on any topic without also measuring maternal depression, because it always accounts for a big part of the variance. So it's really important. It's really treatable. I think we know what to do. We know how to help. We know how to help families with that. And I also think we could really make a really big shift in reducing stigma around postpartum depression in moms and dads, because it's also very common in dads, and sort of change the way we approach the job of taking home a new baby, which is really that our community is welcoming a new person that's going to contribute to all of our well-being if we do a good job, and sort of none of us if we don't, cost a lot if we don't. And so I sort of view it that way. There's the Wisconsin link. Thanks, folks.
Yeah, somebody provided Wisconsin. Yep, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I don't see any other questions in the chat box, so I'm going to close this webinar, unless you have any final comments. Sarah?
No, if you think of questions offline, I'm happy to take them. I'm pretty easy to find. I have a weird name, so feel free to email me or your staffers or whatever.
Thanks so much. So yeah.
Take care.
So again, thanks so much to you, Sarah, for presenting today and giving us this wealth of information and some thoughts to consider. So I just want to remind folks of the resources on the web, and there will be an archived copy of this webinar that will be available shortly. And all of the resources that were mentioned, we'll make sure that we have links to those as well. And let's see, other housekeeping notes. Your feedback is really important to us for creating the most meaningful and beneficial program. An online evaluation survey will pop up on your computer screen at the conclusion of this webinar. Just take a few moments to complete that evaluation. We do take your feedback seriously, and we want to hear from you. I also wanted to make a plug for our Legislative Summit in Boston. Registration is now open, and for legislative staff and any other people that are interested in attending, it's a great forum. We will actually have a session on ACEs, and more information about that is available online or through this link. And then let's see, I wanted to also mention this is part of a webinar series, this webinar today. I can't advance the slides, so let's go back. It's part of a webinar series, and so our next webinar is going to be on May 18th, and which in fact we're going to dig a little deeper into understanding adverse child experiences, so this is very timely. So more information about the webinar series will be on the web, or we're going to share that electronically with you. I also wanted to mention a webinar on May 24th regarding preschool effects and what the research does and does not say. That's going to be, like I said, on May 24th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. You can find more information about that on NCSL's website. Finally, NCSL is here for you. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to email any of the staff, myself or Allison, and we'll certainly get back to you. I'm looking around the room. Is there anything else that I should mention? I just wanted to thank our NCSL staff for giving us support today and putting this webinar together. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. This does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect your lines at this time, and have a great day.